morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're very happy to welcome you all to this next UK lecture on the responses to Ukrainian refugees in Europe. I'm Dr. Agathe Piquet. I'm postdoctoral researcher and co-manager of the Next UK project, so this one. So Next UK, if you're not familiar with this project, it's a journalist center for excellence on the future of EU-UK relations. It's co-funded by the European Commission through the Erasmus Plus scheme and by the Centre for European Research of Queen Mary University of London. So we're very pleased to welcome three experts today to exchange about the different reactions from single and collective actors to Ukrainian refugees. So just to give you a short overview of this topic, so yesterday the UNHCR updated its data, and now it's estimated that more than 4.3 million of Ukrainian people have fled Ukraine. And I'm not talking about the internally displaced people and all the people who have tried to escape Ukraine but have been injured or killed in their journey. And even this morning we heard about that. So these massive flows of people raise key questions about the responses provided by the European Union, by the UK, and by the UNODC. And it's this question that our three speakers will go through today. So first, the European Union, so the member states of the European Union are the forefront of the flows of Ukrainian refugees, and the European Union itself has been very vocal about the imperative to welcome them. The European Union has even used the Temporary Protection Directive, so Florian will explain us what it means, and it enables Ukrainians in Europe to live, work and study for up to 3 years, even though we have already witnessed some varying implementation in EU member states. So key questions such as what explains the adoption of this emergency mechanism now and not during the so-called Syrian migration crisis, what are the other instruments at the disposal of the European Union, how we can also critically assess the reaction of the EU. Then we have a focus on the UK. Some of you may have heard that the UK has taken a very strong stance against the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It has been also criticized for not offering refugee status. So this is like this contradiction that we would like to explore to understand why the UK pursuing such a restrictive policy, how it has been perceived nationally and internationally. Is any change possible? So Sarah will offer us some thoughts on that. And then finally, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has recently shed light on risks in trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants in the current conflict. So we will wonder what is the extent of human trafficking and of migrant smuggling in Ukraine, who are the most vulnerable groups and individuals, what solution does the UNODC recommend, and I think Morgan, you would be the most appropriate person to answer that. So we will start with Florian Troner, with the director of the Research Center for Migration, Diversity and Justice at the VUB. I'm not going to test my Flemish accent on that. And Florian also holds the Jean Monnet Chair Expand, Explaining Resilience in EU Justice and Home Affairs. You also coordinate the VUB Interdisciplinary Center of Expertise on Migration and Minorities. Then our second speaker will be Sarah Wolf, who is the director of the Centre for European Research at Queen Mary University of London. She's also the principal investigator of Next UK and director of the MA International Relations here. Sarah is an expert on EU public policies, especially on migration and border management policies and justice and home affairs more broadly. And then we're really happy to welcome Morgan Nico, who is Team Leader Knowledge Development and Innovation at the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Unit at UNODC. So Morgan has worked for many years around international criminal justice. Then she worked for Caritas, Get Back to the UN, and now she advises the organization, member states, and partners, including private industry. That's something we started to talk about, on issues related to crime prevention, criminal justice, organized crime, migrant smuggling, and human trafficking. So in 1 second, I will leave the floor to our speakers for a 10 minutes individual presentation, and then we will have some time also for Q&A. So you will be able to ask any question that you might have and to exchange with our three speakers on this topic. So thank you once again for being here. Many thanks also to our speakers for joining us today. And now, Florian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Agathe, for the introduction and for inviting me to this interesting event. It's very nice to be such a beautiful place, so close to the Eiffel Tower. It's really a pleasure. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the European Union and the Ukrainian displacement. So, as Agathe has already mentioned, the EU has reacted relatively quickly to the mass influx of Ukrainians by adopting the Temporary Protections Directive. So I will explain a bit what is the origin, the context, and the implications now it has been triggered. And then a few issues that maybe to observe for the EU's policies more widely in the context of the Ukrainian displacement. So let's start with a bit of a context. I mean, we have already heard there are different estimates as to how many Ukrainians may actually become displaced by the Russian invasion. I mean, it all depends how militarily the things evolve. The European Commission assumes that up to 6.5 million Ukrainians could be forced to flee. Right now, this is the numbers I just looked up earlier this week. So a bit more than 4 million people were already displaced. The EU, contrary to, let's say, the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015-2016, they really had a relatively welcoming approach. In particular, Eastern Europeans opened the borders and said everybody who would like to flee is allowed to come and stay. The EU as a whole, 1 week after the invasion, triggered the Temporary Protections Directive. So just to understand what this is, the Temporary Protections Directive assumes that there is a group that is in need of protection. They use asylum procedure based on the Geneva Convention, have always individual assessments. So a person comes, even in the Syrian crisis, for instance, a Syrian came to the European Union, applied for asylum. It was an individual assessment, and never just by the fact that this person is a Syrian was given protection status. With the Temporary Protection Directive, this is different. There is no assessment if the protection claim is justified. Just by the fact that these people are Ukrainians, they get access to the temporary protection regime. And how does this work? So at least for 1 year in the beginning, it can be prolonged. The beginning twice 6 months, but up to 3 years. So the regime is up to years. The people get a residence permit, they get access to the labor markets, they can send their kids to the schools, they get access to subsidiary allowances, social welfare. So this is the basic setup. They can come to any state at the beginning and say, I'm Ukrainian, and the people have the right to stay there. In principle, the law also says that there shouldn't be a kind of an overly responsibility in a few member states only. I mean, let's say Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, where the people are fleeing in first instance, the others should help them. The system says there is this kind of solidarity measures should be based on double voluntarism. This implies that the Ukrainian in question has to agree to be moved, let's say, from Poland to Portugal, and Portugal has to agree that this person is actually moved to Portugal. So both sides have to agree to actually go away from, let's say, the country of first EU entry. What is the strength of the Temporary Protection Directive? It's a flexible instrument. It really avoids that the asylum systems of member states are overburdened. Imagine you have millions of people coming to the European Union, and you would have to assess individually if they can stay. It's simply not possible for the authorities of member states. So it's comprehensive, it's quick, it's also includes a commitment for solidarity. It allows as well, for instance, that the European Union supports Polish or Baltic authorities in dealing with the people, in integrating the kids in schools and so on. I mean, you need a lot of money to cope with the situation. It also establishes a minimum standards for granting temporary protection for the whole of the EU. You don't have to forget that when there is a crisis, a war like this, states or people flee to a few states only. It's always been like in the Kosovo crisis was the same, you know. So people flee only to few states, and in former times before this law existed, these states then they said we accept all the group, but other states didn't do so. So with the temporary protection directive, it's a group protections all over the European Union. So not one state has, let's say, more liberal, more far-reaching rights, and the others is more restrictive. Here it's minimum standards for the all of the EU. Ukrainians have to be treated equally. What are the weaknesses? The weaknesses, it's based a lot upon goodwill. Double voluntarism implies that a state can also say no. So if other member states don't want to support border states, there is no real legal obligations to do so. So it's really depending a bit on the goodwill. And what is also a challenge in the law, at least what was a challenge thus far, has been that the definition of mass influx is very vague. What is a mass influx? So the temporary protection directive should be triggered in a situation of mass influx, but what it actually is in the end a question of interpretation by the member states. They can define what is a mass influx and what not. Why has the temporary protection directive never been used? The temporary protection directive was adopted in 2001 in view of the experience of the Kosovo refugee crisis. So directly thereafter, but it has never been adopted. So more than 20 years, 21 years, it was there. People have already thought, okay, this is a kind of a dead letter. And why has this been so? I mean, one reason is definitely that the EU member states have very different perceptions of EU asylum policy. Some have very restrictive preferences. States such as Hungary have openly said they don't want to accept any migrants coming in and seeking for protections. Other more liberal. So there was a lot of lack of goodwill to cooperate proactively in prior crises. This was one of the reasons. Another one was that influxes only affect few member states, but you have to have a qualified majority voting in the Council of the EU, which decides on the triggering of the directive. We had only one situation in the history of the EU where states wanted to trigger it. This was after the Arab Spring, where Italy and Malta said this is a situation of mass influx, but the other member states said, no, we don't believe this is actually a mass influx. This is manageable also with the system which we had. There was never a discussion in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015, 2016 to trigger the temporary protection directive. And this is a bit related to the other points that I mentioned here. The member states had the impression that the law is a bit too liberal already, that it grants right easily. I mean, they don't have to individually apply. So some member states said it would be a pull factor for more migrants to come to the European Union. When they know that there is a group protection, they don't have to go individual applications, then they may come more easily. That was one of the fear of the member states. Another one was that the EU said we would develop other instruments, be it emergency funding. You have support for the European Asylum Support Office, now the European Asylum Office. You have mechanism for early warning, preparedness, crisis management. So there were a few instruments around the EU's asylum procedure. So this system should be strengthened, but the temporary protection directive was a bit left aside and never used so far. There has been also quite some discussion if there was another reason that made the Ukrainian crisis different from prior crises, and that is the issue of racism, or if in prior crises there was more a focus that, these were not white Christian Europeans coming, but other people. You have relatively blunt statements of European politicians, and the Bulgarian Prime Minister is only one example. But what he said is, this is not a refugee wave. We had been used to people. We were not sure about their identity, people with unclear pasts who could have even been terrorists. So what are the key issues right now? And I'm coming already to an end of my presentation. So far, the question of the distribution of Ukrainians has not been on the table. Poland, a state that has always refused to accept a binding relocation mechanism for migrants of Italy and Greece, has so far not asked any other member states to help them with a relocation of Ukrainians away from their territory. They are relatively consequent in this sense. They say we don't want to help the others. So far, we are not asking others to help us too. But the question is definitely if this can be maintained when numbers rise. So the question there will certainly be a very important one. Another one is the consequences of free choice. I mean, contrary to prior situations, it was always the EU who said to the migrant, you have to go in this state, you have to stay there. This is the principle of the Dublin law, Dublin regime. First country of entry is responsible for an asylum seeker. With Ukrainian, it's basically free choice. They can go wherever they want. But it's legally, because it's relatively untested terrain. What will happen if they stay for 3 months there, then they move to another country? Does it restart? How is it? Is the other state, if they don't accept easily that they are coming there, if they do it on their own, what will happen there? So the portability of rights and duties, this is something I guess that you will see a few legal cases, a few legal challenges to actually have a fine-grained idea how this actually works out.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and thank you so much for organizing this opportunity to exchange the views. So my name is Morgan Nikou. I work with UNODC. UNODC is a UN organization that specializes in organized crime, corruption, terrorism, and drugs, of course. D stands for drugs, C stands for crime. You know that the UN is a large family, there's many specializations. UNODC is part of the Secretariat of the UN, like OHCHR, for example, which specializes in human rights. We are not, let's say, as operational an organization as you would think of UNHCR, for example, that intervenes directly with refugees, or IOM, which is really the foot on the ground. But we're working hand in hand with them, and we are looking at some very specific issues when it comes to intersection regarding international law. So it can be relating to migration, relating to human rights, relating to refugee rights. I, in the work I've been doing for the past 12 years or so with them, I've really been looking at migrant smuggling as per international law. So that comes under the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So that's how it's defined in international law: smuggling and trafficking persons are forms of organized crime. So that's our entry point. But smuggling is also thought differently depending which perspective you take, and especially from a state's perspective, smuggling is very much associated with migration. But smuggling is not only a tool used by people who leave their country for family reunion, for economic reasons, but also sometimes when they need to flee their country, when they have no other means to leave their country. So in that sense, it's very important also to keep in mind the Geneva Convention of 51 on the refugee law. When it comes to trafficking in persons, there are various intersections. You would think slavery, especially when we look at the UK context, given that it's all bundled together. You would think of sexual violence, forced labor, and whatnot. That's something that I will be talking about a little bit more in details in the next lecture. But here, the perspective I'd like to take in complement of the great interventions we've had so far, which I think, yes, there's a great potential for complementarity here. So of course I'm coming from the international law perspective. But I'd like to start with some figures, echoing the introduction made by Agathe earlier on, in order to come to the point of looking at the vulnerability to trafficking and smuggling. and especially linked to the context of conflict. And then moving on to some paths, some ideas to avoid the worst, let's say, when it comes to smuggling and especially trafficking in this context. I see that the first presenter had very, very nice slides. The second one had very nice typed notes. Mine are really just like a bit all over the place, but I think I know what I'm talking about, so I hope I won't be getting lost and talking for half an hour. So you just stop me in case that happens. Yes, so what I wanted to start with is we just heard the latest data from UNHCR, which is that 4.2 million refugees are out of Ukraine and into Europe at the moment. Poland is hosting half of them, and the rest, so it's about not half, so it's 38% at the moment, according to the data I have, then 12% in equally in the Czech Republic, in Germany, and in Spain. The rest is in neighboring countries in Europe mostly. Half of this total refugee population from Ukraine are children. Not all of them are unaccompanied, but some of them are. That's a very, very worrying fact. Now, that's for the externally displaced population. When you look at IDP, so internally displaced people, IOM has done a nationwide survey in Ukraine and published its second general population survey of the type since the beginning of the current international conflict, armed conflict. It dates from the 1st of April, and there's actually 7.9 million internally displaced people in Ukraine at the moment. So when you put it all together, we are well above 11 million people who are displaced internally or externally, who are from Ukraine. Of this population, for the internally displaced persons, it's 59% are women, the largest share. That can be explained for reasons that you know, the mobilization of male, for example. And a huge proportion are children. Same applies for refugees, as I mentioned earlier on. A point I'd like to make now, because you'll understand why it's important, is that since the first survey that IOM did at the, let's say, I think it was about a month ago, and the one they did now, the amount of persons with no income among those who have been displaced has tremendously increased. And that's at least 1/3 of these people who have absolutely no income. So they are not anymore living in their usual place of residence, they don't have support systems anymore, and they don't have income. Those who do have income have much less income than they used to have. Obviously, for the refugee population, same applies. So there's really, really one of the first or the main concern of those people altogether, these 11 million plus people, is how to survive. No cash, sometimes no access to their accounts, no job anymore. That puts them in an extremely vulnerable situation. And that will explain my second point on vulnerability after presenting this more general situation. I'll do a rather quick point on migrant smuggling. So migrant smuggling is the facilitation of illegal entry with the aim to make a profit out of it. So basically, there's an exchange of money most of the time. You pay me, I help you cross in an irregular manner. Usually, I mean, to really to do it short. In the case of the Ukrainians coming into the EU, as we've heard, a measure that's actually exceptional. It's never been put in place. It was existing, but for many reasons we've heard had not been used yet. We have almost no smuggling. We could even probably say there's no smuggling, but actually I'll come to that detail. That's one of the most effective ways to prevent smuggling is actually to open legal ways. And we're having a perfect example here, which I hope we will not forget too soon, so that we can always refer back to it and remind states that yes, this works and that should be done. That's the best way to prevent smuggling and criminal networks to make a profit out of the need for people to flee danger. Now, there were some people who were not Ukrainians living in Ukraine, and that's where we may have a risk of smuggling. We've seen some, and we've also seen something that's associated with smuggling, which is document fraud. So even smugglers providing potential migrants, refugees, asylum seekers with documents which are not genuine, which are look-alike, which have been counterfeited, etc. There were suspicions of such cases happening because that was actually the best way to cross the border, being able to show that you are Ukrainian. Those populations who don't have the Ukrainian nationality have been facing pushbacks at the border. We know that. So that remained a problem. So here they can be smuggling. They may be smuggling as well for this same population as secondary movement once they've reached the neighboring countries. But that's not the main issue. The main issue here, from UNODC's perspective and those instruments I told you about, is trafficking in persons. And why is that? Women, children are the majority of this population. They are isolated. They are not around their usual communities. They may not have income. They may not speak the language. It's a very scary situation and a very dangerous one too. So that's why all the media have been talking about these risks, and these risks are real. What could happen when you're in this type of situations? And we've been studying refugee populations. We've been studying trafficking conflict. So I may distinguish what happens within the country in conflict and what happens outside, but in the end, there are some patterns that you can see. Of course, what happens in, let's say, in territory that was controlled by Daesh in the Middle East is very different from what happens here at the border of Europe. So some of the examples I may leave aside, but some are common. So some of the greatest risk are trafficking persons for sexual exploitation. That can be inside and outside of the conflict zone. For sexual slavery, that's what, for example, we saw with ISIL Daesh. Probably less likely in the Ukraine. Forced marriage was also probably more outside than inside Ukraine. Forced recruitment by armed groups, that's a risk that children do face. And exploitation for forced labor, that's also pretty common. But when we look at those refugee populations outside of Ukraine, you would see sexual exploitation and forced labor as being the type of exploitation that these people are most likely to be subjected to. But when you look at really the subsets of it, and based on the fact that Ukrainians, and especially Ukrainian women, have been for many, many years, and way before conflict erupted there, among the main exploited population in Europe. In the figures we've had in the global report on trafficking in persons that UNODC publishes every other year, Ukrainian population have been the second or first most detected group or nationality of people detected in Europe as being trafficked. So what we've seen is that yes, sexual exploitation was very high on the list, but you also have trafficking persons for illegal surrogacy, for example. That's a risk. For forced criminality and for begging, which may often be used on children. As well as when you have children, and that's a risk that's real at the moment, is using the situation to exploit illegal adoption opportunities as well, when you have isolated children. And last but not least, and I think that echoes some of the fears that the UK authorities have always brandished when it came to restricting some of the prerogatives under international law, is that there's always a suspicion of trying to take advantage of the rights that can be given to some populations, to non-nationals. Exploitation for fraud from benefit schemes, for example, is something that may also happen. For example, the elderly people or children may have access to certain protection and benefits that opportunistic individuals may want to take advantage of. I was thinking of, I didn't know about this scheme about a home for refugees, for Ukrainians. It's not that much money, but it's still some money that will be given to people. Actually, would they be having an incentive to host people out of their generosity, or more because it's an extra source of income? Some people may argue that. And that leads me to what's been happening. It's this immense wave of solidarity that you've seen in the neighboring countries, but also beyond that. I live in Austria, and I've seen many people hosting Ukrainians at their place for a short or longer term, but also taking their cars and going to the border in the first days of the conflict to come and help them, to drive them away from this. The thing is that who are they? That's amazing, this solidarity that's been shown, but there's also a huge risk, and I know people were at the border that could see that some very shady people were there. They saw children isolated alone being in the middle of that, and that was extremely scary. And there's been some systems that have been put in place slowly by NGOs, by the authorities in some countries, of volunteers having to register themselves, of refugees being able to take pictures and of the plate of the car, of the IDs of the people picking them up, in order somehow to have some safeguards. But that remains problematic. And so when you see what's happening there, you see that civil society has been extremely important. NGOs' role is amazing, but they may not all be equipped with understanding the situation of the people, with understanding the risks of exploitation, and especially of being able to detect what would be these signs among the people they're crossing the way. What we've heard so far is that, yes, risk of trafficking is huge, but how many cases have been reporting so far? We're in touch with authorities from the neighboring countries, with NGOs, and almost none. It's probably too soon, first of all. And probably also many people are just not yet fully informed of what it means. So there's something to be done about the vulnerability of the people, so that they don't become trafficked, they don't become exploited. And I'll quickly touch upon that. Yes, I just wanted to wrap up on the vulnerability. So obviously the gender and the age are a factor of vulnerability. Women, children may be more exposed. Family breakdown and isolation. No men around, children having lost their relatives, and being forcibly displaced. You don't have your usual setup to assist you. So now, let's move to what could be done, especially with a focus on the conflict context. First of all, and that's what's happening here with the colleagues who've been intervening, and with you possibly in your studies and works, research and information gathering. That's essential. We can see this at play at the moment. There's plenty of excellent organizations, researchers, who are gathering that information on the ground in order for us to know what's happening day after day, and to take the right measures that would be necessary to prevent the situation from worsening in terms of potential exploitation. Prevention should be what we should focus on, so that it doesn't happen. Of course, when we think about protection, very often we think about awareness raising campaigns. Why not but that's a very superficial way of preventing. We need to go way more in depth into that, and the measures that were decided at the EU level, I mentioned, is one of the most effective way of protecting, because they are in preventing exploitation, because they actually give access to the work market, to the labor market, and to education to the people who have fled. So these are two of the most important things, because then they can generate income again, they can be finding new communities and being integrated, and that provides some protection, and learn the language hopefully as well, which would make them less exposed to profit-seeking individuals, including from their communities, who would pretend to be protecting them, but actually just finding a new opportunity to exploit them. So measures to address vulnerability, to building resilience as well is very important. So that also means food security, accommodation, to make it happen. Also working on sexual and gender-based violence at large in the country in any case, but also seeing it from a discrimination perspective, to making sure that there's no risk to use negative coping mechanisms, basically for people who are in desperate situation, and we think they have no choice, I do need to turn, for example, to sex work, because I don't see how. And there's really a need to be specifically attentive to that. What's very important as well, and that is even more probably important in the current context inside of Ukraine, is to continue making sure to register birth, marriage, death. When you don't have functioning registration systems, you have children who are not registered and will become missing, and anything can happen to them. That's a real risk. With marriage, I was talking about forced marriage before. Same, if the marriage is registered, there's a lesser risk of exploitation for these means. And of course, the need to reduce demand for exploitative labor, and that I would say more maybe in the neighboring countries or refugee hosting countries, so that there's no temptation to use these populations without declaring them, and by underpaying them, etc. So there's a real need to be attentive to having the right framework also to prevent that from happening. So that was my second point on prevention after research. The last point I'll make is about protection and assistance itself. It needs to be victim-centered. So it's all about what's happening to the people, what they want, what they need, and adapt the solutions to their profiles. Children, a small boy may not have the same need as an elderly lady who is sick and isolated. They may both be isolated, but they would not have the same needs. So that really needs to be taken into account. What needs to be done, and it's being done at the moment, is mapping of who's there to do what for, and where. NGO coalitions and networks have been doing it very well. International organizations, regional organizations are currently doing it as well. That's extremely important. That and coordination. There's no need to be stepping on each other's feet and all wanting to do the same while leaving huge gaps, which is typical of the international community. Now is really a time to be effective. I think there's a bit of chaos, because that's always the case in these situations, but I think we're not doing so bad. And that's very, very important, and that needs to continue. What we're doing, so I've been talking mostly about the UN at large right now, but UNODC is part of it, because our expertise is in trafficking. We're also talking with NGOs in order to make sure that they build their anti-trafficking toolkit, meaning that they understand what are the indicators of trafficking in persons, depending on the population they have in front of them. So some of the vulnerability factors I talked to you about, some other things like who do they live with Do they pay this person? Are they controlled in any way? I will tell you more in the next lecture for those who are taking it. What does it mean, the control, and why is it important in trafficking? All these, let's say, not evidence, but these indications that they should be looking more in depth into the situation of the person. For example, I was talking with someone from IOM Czech Republic last week, and he was saying, right now what we start seeing is people who have been hired, so Ukrainian refugees who have been hired in restaurants, and after they've been hired, suddenly some mobsters, almost some people that have been established in the city for long, come and ask for money on behalf of these people. They want to be paid their wages because they estimate that they should be having control on the situation. See, things like this are appearing slowly. Someone else in Poland, I'd been in the border volunteering with Caritas in the first couple of weeks of the invasion, and he said that because he works in tech, he also infiltrated somehow social networks and chat rooms, and he went to Telegram, for example, and he said this is just awful. People are preying on children there. This is very obvious. This is happening now. We need to do something. We need to have control mechanisms. We've heard of this. It's not news. We know it's happening. With the COVID situation, we've heard more and more about the exploitation, online exploitation of children, recruitment through social media. But now, in this current crisis, this is also being done big time via WhatsApp and Telegram and the rest. So we're currently discussing indeed with private sector to try and see what can be done effectively, really, to monitor that and to stop that from happening. One of the big rules of UNODC is to make sure that there's no impunity. So when it happens, when trafficking persons happens, make sure that investigators, first that victims are identified. I mentioned the indicators before, that they are referred to the appropriate authorities, that these authorities are able to investigate properly, and that evidence is collected to be successful in your cases in front of the judge. So we accompany this process, and we're currently talking, of course, with law enforcement, prosecutors, judges in Moldova, in Romania. Traditionally, we don't work so much with EU countries. We work more with the developing countries. But here we're changing a bit, and we're teaming up with partners we already had before, for example, European agencies, Europol, etc., Eurojust, to make it happen in the most effective way, especially when it comes to exchanging information and evidence and intelligence across borders, so that these cases can be followed even if people move or exploited further ahead. So I think that's what I wanted to touch upon. I may have gone a bit beyond my time. Thanks for not stopping me.